In our last two improv videos, we've talked about how to play over a chord cloud and how to play over a one chord vamp. We've talked about how to use a scale over chords, meaning picking which notes we're going to use. And we've talked about playing on an eighth note grid, landing on chord tones on strong beats. But all of that has been over a one chord vamp. There are not very many tunes that are going to ask you to only play over one chord. So this week we're going to talk about how to get from one chord to another. Think of soloing like driving. We have to follow the rules of the road and we have to drive safely without knocking into anything. But we also have to get somewhere, right? We have to navigate. We're going to have to make some turns. When you leave your driveway, what happens? You've got to get instructions from your GPS or your navigator, and they're going to tell you in 2 miles, take a left-hand turn onto Smith Road. I need to know when and then where. Soloing is a lot like that. In a good band, a bass player is going to act as your navigator, especially if they know that maybe you don't know the outline of the tune that well. They'll kind of signal when they're coming to a chord change by moving to that next chord and predicting that for you. Most of the time in a pop, rock, country, or worship band, there's a couple of different sets of chord changes. There's like verse changes, chorus changes, bridge changes. You're going to know what those changes are because you've played over them. And then at some point, somebody's going to say, hey, take a solo over the chorus changes. In your mind, you'll know what those changes are and you can follow those. So how do we get from one chord to another? Let's work through some examples. We'll do some 12-bar blues in D. That's going to give us a chance to make some different chord changes, and we can walk you through those. So in 12-bar blues in D, the very first change we've got to make is getting from a D chord to a G chord. Now remember, we generally want to land on a strong beat on a chord tone, so let's lay those out and see what those are. What are the chord tones in G? G, B, and D. So we want to land on one of those on the chord change. And imagine that we're mostly using D minor pentatonic when we're playing over D. So how do we get from that D minor pentatonic to a G major chord? We're landing on a chord tone. One option is to find a note in the D minor pentatonic scale that's the same note as the G major triad, and then just stay on that note as the chord changes underneath us. So what are our options here? We've got D and G. Both of those are in the D minor pentatonic scale. Both of those are in the G chord. Let's hear some examples of how we might do that. All right, another option is to find a half-step move from the D minor pentatonic scale to a G chord, so we can kind of create a leading tone type move there, right? What are our options? Well, it looks like it's kind of C to B natural. So let's hear that. Another option is to find a whole note move from the D minor pentatonic scale to a G major triad so that we can create sort of a scale motion type sound. And here are some options there. We can go from F to G, we can go from A to B, we can go from C to D. Now, obviously, there are lots and lots of options for how to get from one chord to another. These are a couple of examples that hopefully are going to unlock some ideas in your brain and give you some tools to work with as you're getting started here. Now, there are a bunch more changes to go in this 12-bar blues, but let's outline one more so that you can kind of see what we're doing here and you can do the rest of that yourself. The next change is to get from G back to D. So how are we going to do that? Let's imagine that we're playing over the G major pentatonic scale when we're in G, and then we want to go to a D major triad. We want to land on a strong tone on the one. So your G major pentatonic, G, A, B, D, E, and then we want to land on either D, F sharp, or A, right? So what are some non-move moves we can do? Where do they line up? A and D. So let's hear some of those. All right, how about some half step moves from the G major pentatonic to a D major triad? The one obvious one is from G to F sharp. Now, what about whole step moves so we can kind of create some stepwise motion? There are a number of choices here. Let's explore just a couple of those. All right, so those are a couple of ways to get from one chord to another. There are a lot more ways than that, but this is a simple one. And I recommend mastering a couple of these before we start trying to get cute with all kinds of chromatic nonsense and substitutions and all that. Now, one obvious problem with this approach is it feels a little bit more like doing math than playing music. But if we're analytical people, we're kind of stuck reading sheet music and we want some rules to help us figure out how to do this improv thing. These are a couple rules that maybe you can get comfortable with. And as you've learned, okay, I can now feel how to get from one chord to another, this is maybe a starting point. So when you're practicing this week, maybe find some backing tracks on YouTube that display the chords on the screen so you can see them. And then sit down and write out some diagrams like we did. What scale am I going to use over this chord? And then how do I land on a strong tone? And then I can see where my arrows line up, decide which approach I'm going to use, and then practice getting from one to the other. The more you do this, the more you're going to start being able to do it by feel, and then you won't have to do so much drawing and arrow making. It'll be less math and more music. The good news is that in pop and rock music, there are some super, super common chord progressions, and there are going to be some moves that you make all the time. You're going to move from 1 to 4 a lot. You're going to move from 1 to 5 a lot. You're going to move from 4 to 5 a lot. You're going to move from 1 to 6 a lot. Once you've mastered sort of those 4 or 5 changes, how to get from one of these chords to another, you're going to start feeling these patterns repeating themselves over and over in pop and rock and jazz and country and worship music. The 2-5 in jazz happens all the time. Once you've got that move figured out, you've got a lot of jazz figured out. All right, one last thing to consider, playing a scale over a chord. These are not shackles that are holding you in. This is just a framework to work on. You don't have to stick with that. If a non-diatonic note is just screaming your name, play it. If it helps you get from one chord to another, do it, okay? This is supposed to be fun. So happy practicing, enjoy this, and we'll see you next time.